The slow realization of who he was, of why he was standing in front of her after all these years. And suddenly, for a brief moment, he wasn't in the cold streets of Los Angeles anymore. He was a boy again, standing on a small school stage, gripping a script in his sweaty hands. Her voice echoed in his mind. On stage, you never hide. You feel. You live. Then, just as quickly, he was back in the present, looking at the woman who had once taught him everything he knew about acting, now unrecognizable. Keanu's chest tightened. How had this happened? He swallowed hard and finally broke the silence. Is it really you? She took a shaky breath, her voice barely more than a whisper. I think so. Her words felt heavy, as if they carried the weight of years. Keanu hesitated. There were so many things he wanted to ask, but something told him he had to tread carefully. He started, then stopped. What could he even say? Mrs. Collins tried to shift, but her body barely responded. She shivered, and Keanu, without thinking, shrugged off his leather jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched at the sudden warmth but didn't resist. Then, in a voice so soft he almost didn't hear it, she murmured, "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" Keanu nodded. Yes. A long time. But no number of years could have prepared him for this. Got it. Here's your script with slight adjustments to the word order while keeping your style, tone, and natural flow intact. The silence stretched unanswered. Keanu sat beside her, unbothered by the cold, dirty pavement. She didn't have to answer right now, but he wasn't going anywhere. He would wait. Mrs. Collins clutched the blanket tighter around herself, as if it were the only thing keeping her together. Her breathing had steadied, but her gaze remained distant. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice low and rough. You shouldn't be here. Keanu met her eyes, calm. And you should. She let out a short, humorless laugh. Nice one, Reeves. He didn't smile. There was something in her eyes, something beyond pain, shame. She didn't want to be seen like this. But he had already seen her. Mrs. Collins took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to keep going. The truth is, I don't know what to say. I didn't want anyone to see me like this. Least of all, you. Keanu remained silent. He knew that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. She hesitated, her eyes locked on the empty street. Then finally, she began. I lost my job when they cut the theater program. Keanu had suspected something like that. But hearing it from her made it real. I tried to keep going, she continued. I gave private lessons for a while, took small jobs here and there, but things started to fall apart. The bills piled up. The city swallowed me whole. She paused, her gaze drifting into memories too painful to relive all at once. At first, I thought it was just a rough patch, that I'd find something new, that everything would go back to normal. But months passed, and suddenly, I had no home. A knot tightened in Keanu's throat. He had always known life could be cruel, but he had never imagined she had fallen this far. I spent some time bouncing from couch to couch, staying with people who still cared, she said. But doors started to close. People get tired. No one wants a long-term problem in their life. Keanu knew that was true. The world could be merciless. Mrs. Collins rubbed her hands together, as if trying to shake off a cold that had settled deep inside her. And then, before I realized it, it was too late. Keanu's chest ached. He thought of everything she had meant to him, how she had encouraged him, helped him find his voice on stage. And now she was here, alone. Broken. He wanted to say something, but before he could, she murmured, almost to herself, the hardest part isn't losing things. It's losing people. She pressed her lips together, as if holding something bigger inside. Then, her voice dropped lower, trembling. I pushed everyone away, Keanu. The few who still cared. Because the truth is, I didn't want to be a burden. A chill ran through him. He knew that feeling. The sense that you're dragging people down, that it's better to disappear than to become someone else's problem. He knew that shadow. But seeing it in her hurt in a way he wasn't prepared for. Then she said something that made his heartbeat quicken. And I made a mistake I can't undo. She didn't explain. But Keanu noticed the hesitation in her voice, the weight behind her words. There was something else, something she wasn't ready to say. Not yet. The silence stretched between them. Keanu ran a hand through his hair, thinking. He wanted to ask the right questions, but he knew he couldn't push. So, he simply said, firmly, "You're not a burden to me." Mrs. Collins closed her eyes, looking away. "You say that now?" Keanu shook his head. "I say that because it's true." She let out a long breath, like she wanted to believe him, but couldn't. And then, he asked the question he didn't want to ask but knew he had to. "What about your children?" The air between them shifted. Mrs. Collins' body tensed. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, barely audible, she whispered, "They tried to help me. For a while." The incomplete answer made Keanu's stomach turn. What had happened with her children? Why was she here alone? Before he could ask anything else, Mrs. Collins' gaze drifted back to the empty street. She seemed far away, lost in memories he couldn't reach. And for the first time that night, Keanu saw something in her eyes that unsettled him. A silent darkness. A pain too deep to put into words. Something beyond physical suffering. And he knew her story was far worse than he had imagined. And he hadn't heard all of it yet.